welcome once again, and we're going to record this on Zoom. Oh, we're going to record this for later on YouTube. Okay. Okay, I started recording. Ernest, give your permission, and then you can start.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name's Ernest Leung. I'm from the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong. I'm postdoctoral fellow there, and I earned my PhD and MPhil in Japanese studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Before that, I majored in history and French at the University of Hong Kong. Now, I research about a number of things. I research mainly about the planned economy in East Asia, how all of East Asia's regimes at some point adopted the planned economy and how it was imported from places like Germany and the Soviet Union throughout the late 19th century to the early 20th century. I also talk about single party states and parliamentary history in some of my other papers. If you search online, you'll find my Twitter. Now called X, of course, and you'll see some of my publications and threads, which I hope will interest you. So, Joseph, should I start my?
Yes, go
So,
ahead.
what's the flow? Right.
So you can share your PPT now when you're ready.
Yes. Right. So today I'm going to talk about agricultural collectivism in East Asia, which is actually the last chapter of my PhD dissertation, which concerns the rise of the planned economy in East Asia. Now, collectivization in East Asia has always been assumed to be a disastrous policy specific to post-war socialist regimes like the PRC and North Korea. However, what I argue is that collectivization had its roots in agricultural reform movements even before the First World War. It started during the late Meiji era, during the late 19th century. And the fruits of these social reformist movements were appropriated by what I call state monopoly capitalist policies. What this means is that the state runs an entrepreneurial state. It is both an extractive and also an investing state. It invests in industry and agriculture, but it also extracts from the producers in the reproduction or the expansion of that particular economic order. And it is also managerialist. So, in the sense that before agricultural collectivization, you've got landlords running agriculture. Once you've got agricultural communes set up, you would find that the state would appoint managers to run these collectives, and it basically running them as factories. So instead of the usual imagination of a farmer being free and being the only person who is responsible for his own production and his own investment, farms are being run as large factories, and things are being streamlined, and it's a production line concept imported from practices like the Ford factory. Fordism being one of the main currents of industrial thought during the early 20th century. So imagine a large farm being run like a Ford factory, and this then allows total war to be, prosecuted because when you can't plan for agricultural production, you can't really have total war. You can't really mobilize for total war. So by 1940, not only in industry, but also in agriculture, all regimes in East Asia adopted the planned economy, which is impossible without collectivization. And this is also one rare scenario where it isn't just China importing Japanese influences, but also Japan importing Chinese influences. And you see why that is later on. Now, the origins of agricultural collectivism goes back a long way because charity granaries have always existed in East Asia. These were set up by local prefects or by landlords with, some charitable motivation. Um, some of the produce is stored in granaries and is then distributed to peasants during years of bad harvest. Now, but the modern way of organizing cooperatives was started by someone called Hirata Tosuke, who studied in Germany, and he brought back the German models of cooperative organization, and he then influenced someone called Mi Ligang, who was a Chinese student in Japan, and who returned to China and started some of China's first agricultural collectives. This then influenced the provincial governor of Shanxi province, Yan Xishan, who started something called the Six Policies and the Three Tasks. And by 1922, Shanxi province was already a model province in China when it comes to the agricultural collectivization, which leads to the planting of millions of mulberry trees, which of course is important to the silk trade, and also curing hundreds of thousands of opium addicts and liberating the feet of all girls above 16 in 100 prefectures. You might know, of course, that Chinese girls at the time had banned feet, which was a very, well, even as a Chinese person, I would say is a barbaric practice. And liberating the feet, which means that the feet were sort of, opened up again, is a very painful thing, of course, but requires a lot of government intervention for the provincial gentry to adopt such practices and to discard the old practice of feet binding, that is. Now, someone called Nishihara Kamezo then stepped um, in another paper, which is on Phenomenal World. I talk about how Nishihara Kamezo, who was assistant to the Japanese Prime Minister at the time, proposed having an East Asian Economic League, which was based on German state socialism. German state socialism was started by Bismarck. Basically, Bismarck was in competition with the Social Democrats, but he then said, well, I'm going to suppress the Social Democrats and take over what the Social Democrats were advocating in terms of social benefits, in terms of nationalizing the railways and key industries, and I'm going to use these social policies as the foundations of a conservative state. So from that point on, Bismarck was called state socialism. And Nishihara Kamezo um, imported German state socialism into East Asia, especially the model of German state socialism developed by Walter Rathenau, who was the head of the raw material section of the German Ministry during the First World War. And he was the person who invented the planned economy. So during 1917, 1918, Nishihara Kamezo proposed having an East Asia-wide planned economy, not only investing in China in terms of providing something like a Marshall Plan for China, but also collectivizing industry and agriculture within Japan. And he was looking at the Haiphesen and Schutz-Delitzsch cooperative models in Germany. And he advocated comprehensive land reform, which is to distribute land to the peasants and then to organize the peasants into cooperatives. So that would allow the economy to be planned and organized as a unity, and then um, the target was to raise Japan's national income per capita from 60 yen per head to 200 yen per head. which is still much lower than Western European countries, according to Nishihara's statistics, but it was high enough for Japan at the time. Now, he also advocated having an imperial commodities corporation buying produce from the cooperatives and selling them in city centre department stores, thus eliminating the entire retail industry because he saw businessmen as being responsible for wartime inflation and for economic chaos. However, these proposals were too late to save Japan, and especially to save Prime Minister Teruji Tamasaki, because the rice riots happened in the summer 1918 due to high rice prices, and Prime Minister Teruji had to step down afterwards. But this did not stop China from, continuing the um, cooperative movement, because the Anthem Club, which was effectively China's first single-party state, even before the Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party took hold of China, they governed between 1918 and 1920, and they advocated having cooperatives to facilitate things like mechanization, irrigation, and the use of chemical fertilizers, and to prevent social class warfare. They were, of course, the regime that cooperated with Nishihara Kamezo during 1917, 1918, and they probably were influenced by some of Nishihara's calls for cooperativization. And they also made reference to German and Danish models, Denmark being a country very well known for having effective agricultural cooperatives at the time. Unfortunately, in 1920, there was a civil war in China which toppled the Anthem Club regime, and cooperatives were not heard of until much later during the 1920s. Now, one person who continued this movement in China was Liang Shuming, who was a Neo-Confucian. He taught things like Buddhist philosophy, Indian philosophy, Confucianism in Peking University. And he then, by the late 1920s, he then tried his hand at organizing cooperatives. He was inspired by Midigang, and he thought that the CCP, having its communist ways of, struggling against gentry to promote land reform was too violent. So what he advocated was having the gentry as part of the new cooperative. You would have a village school as the center of all activity in the village, and you would have the gentry being re-educated in the village school in modern practices, in modern agricultural practices, and you would have the gentry take part in modernizing the village. Now, he also saw industry and industrialization as being something that China should not take up as a future direction. Industrialization would bring all sorts of social maladies. So the best way for China to go forward was to have agriculture as the basis of national construction, and to have cooperatives led by the gentry as being the social basis of the new Chinese state. But by 1936, the Sino-Japanese War was already happening, and he went to Japan, and he observed how Japan was organizing its agricultural collectives to help industry, and he saw that reciprocal relationship between industry and agriculture. So by 1937, his stance has changed, and he thought that the point of having collectives is to allow agriculture to be planned and for industry to develop in a direction that serves the demands of agriculture. In Japan, what happened was that Japan itself, the home islands, were very slow in starting the agricultural cooperativization movement. In fact, Korea, which was a Japanese colony at the time, under Governor Ugagi Katsushige, started something called colonial corporatism. He started an agricultural revival movement, which made, as part of the movement, personalized 5-year plans for selected families. So families in Korea at the time were suffering from the Great Depression, of course, and they were borrowing lots of money from loan sharks. What Urage was doing was that he was making these 5-year plans for these families to get out of their long-term debt in 5 years' time, so that they can produce more and be in less debt and be more linked to the state. Now, that was emulated by the early Manchukuo being the creation of Japan in Manchuria, which is now called Northeast China. It was a puppet state, and it was being run by Japanese bureaucrats and military officers. Um, Otsumi Chuji was prefect of Shinjuku County in Taiwan, and he was the first local leader in the empire to implement a 5-year plan, which made as part of the plan um, cooperatives for agriculture and light industry. By 1932, Inu Katsuyoshi, who was Prime Minister of Japan, announced a 5-year plan on Soviet lines for Japan. But he was assassinated because he wouldn't acknowledge the existence or the legitimacy of Manchukuo, which was started, as I said, by rogue military officers in northeast China. So Inukai was assassinated, but the 5-year plan was continued without being called as such by the finance minister at the time, Takahashi Korekiyo. And it was called the Agricultural Mountains and Fishing Village Renovation Movement, which then had, as part of the plan, um, the total corporativization of Japan, and the making of personalized 5-year plans, like what Ugagi Katsushige was doing in Korea. And by 1938, there was already a planning commission for this particular movement, which was a first step towards a new economic system, which was set up in 1940, which involved a totally planned economy for industry as well as agriculture. So, as part of um, the farming village movement that I just talked about, um, there was a slogan called Jiriki Kosei. It means revitalization through one's own um, endeavor. Now, this slogan was started as part of that movement, and it existed because the state was not investing enough money into the movement, and therefore a lot of the local prefects had to ask local landlords and local businessmen to invest in the revitalization of local agriculture. So, revitalization through one's own endeavor or through self-reliance was a pretty desperate slogan. If the state isn't helping us, then we must help ourselves. The irony is that this slogan was imported into China during the 1930s, during its war with Japan, because China was being landlocked. All of the ports were occupied by Japan. Um, China had very few resources and facilities to fight Japan with. So the only way of, prosecuting the war of resistance against Japan was to use one's own endeavor to revitalize one's own state. So this slogan became China's leading slogan through the 1930s to the 1970s, when China re-entered the international arena again. Now,
Yes. Oh, Dr. Long, you have a minute left. Can you wrap it up?
yes, so the Chinese Kuomintang Nationalist Party um, started cooperatives again in the 1920s in order to take advantage of commercial capital, which was stagnant due to the Great Depression, and they couldn't be invested into industry. So it went back into agriculture, and they were pretty successful in promoting agricultural collectives in eastern China. Um, and also in 1936 onwards, um, left-wingers in Japan who were part of the Communist Party and the Communist Youth League escaped to Manchukuo, and they started cooperatives there with elevating the status of poor peasants in mind. They thought that social revolution in Manchukuo would lead to higher production for the army to take advantage of and to be used in the war against China's Nationalist Party, which they saw as being backward, reactionary, and anti-popular in the left-wing sense of the word. So they didn't see themselves as being colonialist or imperialist, but they saw themselves as a left-wing project within a right-wing imperial state. And by 1937 onwards, this was taken over by a new system in Manchukuo, with Kodara Gonichi, who was helping Nishihara, as I just said, with the proposals in the 1910s. And they then took over the cooperatives and evicted the left-wingers. In fact, the left-wingers were imprisoned by the military police in Manchukuo, and the cooperatives were handed back to the old landlords. So a full cycle happened. The landlords were initially deposed, but they were then given back the cooperatives. And however, the main legacy is that for the first time in Manchukuo's history or in Chinese history, full planning could take place for agricultural production. And you can see that even Caterpillar tractors were being introduced into China, and fairly complex methods of irrigation and planting were being imported into China. And this then, of course, had an effect on Japan itself, because by 1942, even Japan had to organize a much more unified system of food rationing and produce procurement. And the Imperial Village Consolidation Campaign started, in fact, the process of land reform, which wouldn't be complete until well after the Second World War. Um, and in China, the cooperatives started by the Nationalist Party inspired a American slogan called Gung Ho. Gung Ho actually was an abbreviation which meant industrial cooperative. Now, if you've heard of Gung Ho, you know it means zealous. You know it means that you're enthusiastic about doing something. Now, in fact, it was so popular that the term gasakusha or cooperative was imported back into Japan from the Chinese language. And by the late 1940s, Kunio Chojiro was trying to start Japanese cooperatives on the Chinese model because he saw how effective it was in helping China resist Japan. And so it must help Japan reorganize itself after the chaos of surrender. And the CCP inherited the Manchukuo cooperatives after a long debate between Gao Gang and Liu Shaoqi. Gao Gang's model of inheriting the cooperatives and organizing larger communes instead of parceling the land and distributing them to peasants won the argument of the day, and it became the policy of people's communes. However, he committed suicide in 1954 due to an inner party power struggle, but the
Mhm.
people's communes became a very important aspect of policy throughout the 1960s and 70s, and they weren't disbanded until 1983. And in fact, Taiwan also continued the policy of corporatization, especially after 1948 when American aid came into Taiwan to help these cooperatives. And they started something like planting bananas in order to take advantage of the Western market, which was
Sure.
very receptive to these tropical produces. In North
Ernest, we need
Korea,
to
as in South Korea, this is the last slide. In North
okay.
Korea, as in South Korea, the colonial cooperative system was continued and expanded. The production responsibility system became a cornerstone of North Korean agricultural policy. And in South Korea, this inspired the Semo movement of the 1970s. which was a movement to start so-called new villages, where the state would give cement for the construction of roads, for the construction of better housing, tiles instead of thatch roofs, that sort of thing. So the conclusion is that all these had a huge influence on East Asian modernization well after the Second World War. And in fact, Judiki Kose is still seen at Dajai Commune in Shanxi province, where, as I said, corporatization in China started. And this commune was the best organized commune in China during the Mao era, and it still used this 1930s Japanese slogan, revitalization through one's own endeavor, and it's still seen at the entrance of the commune. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Long, for that fascinating history of the intersections between China, Korea, and Japan. Okay, so I think there was a long history lesson. So I think we're going to move on to Mark Ramsier, who will discuss both history and the politics of history. Go ahead, Mark, and introduce yourself. Professor Mark Ramsier from Harvard Law School.
Sure. Hi. My name, as Joseph says, is Mark Ramsier. I teach at Harvard Law School. I gather I'm invited here because of a 8-page article that I wrote about a decade ago. I'm a really old guy, and I've been in this a long time. And all this attention for one 8-page article is intriguing, I guess. But I work on Japanese law. I teach at an American law school. For the most part, I use analytic tools from economics in order to understand the way that people make use of law, respond to it, and so forth. I had, some 30 years ago, come across interesting statistical material on contracts in Japanese domestic prostitution industry, which I thought was interesting. And I wrote an article on it, and I think probably 6 people read it. But I went on. And then maybe 15 years ago or so, I was doing really completely unrelated work and came across a series of materials on the comfort women in World War II. And these were the women who were attached to private brothels that were in turn next to the Japanese bases or outposts during the late 1930s and early 1940s. And the contracts that they were using were different in what I thought were interesting ways to how the domestic prostitutes had been working. The pay was higher and the indenture term was shorter. Otherwise, they were very similar. It seemed like it was worth about a 10-page article, which I wrote, and the editor said, actually, Ramsier, this is sort of interesting, but it's really only worth 8 pages, not 10. And so it went. But then everything went wild. A friend in Japan summarized it for a national newspaper in Japan, and the newspaper got covered in South Korea. And the South Korean press decided to make a big deal of it because I was discussing these women as, for the most part, Japanese women who were very poor and chose to do this for reasons that for thousands and thousands of years, poor young women have chosen to do so from time to time across the world. That's not the story I discovered in South Korea. The story is that had been, no longer, I gather, but at the time still was that they were mostly Korean young women who had been dragooned at bayonet point and worked as sex slaves. I didn't spend any time on this because, frankly, it's not something that anybody who really works in this area takes seriously. If you spend any time at all on the literature, this sex slave story dates from the mid-1980s. A Japanese would-be author with a communist background wrote what he styled to be a memoir that he had been told to go to South Korea by the army to gather some women to work as comfort women. So he went in with a posse of soldiers and took the women at bayonet point, raped them, and sent them to the bases. Lots of things about the memoir didn't fit with Japanese history. Historians were suspicious. They asked him, and the author, before he died, pretty much admitted that he made the whole story up. The Japanese newspaper that had carried this stuff and made a big deal out of it recruited historians and sent reporters over to check up the facts on this, and concluded that, yep, this was all made up, and it retracted all the articles that it had published on it, and that was the end of it. But the response I got was wild. And there are a couple of things that are going on here. One is that I'm an old guy, and you make enemies throughout your career. This was a time for people who had grievances to cash in. I can be an obnoxious guy. I'm a smartass. So this was their chance for revenge. I had responses from basically three groups. The largest group and the loudest, really, were South Korean immigrants in the U.S., I think, for the most part, South Korean exchange students and so forth. They were the ones who were sending these emails. The first day I had 70 plus. A good number of them were death threats, very colorful, and so forth. This group and petitions, apparently one petition that went to Harvard had 30,000 people signing it. And I can assure you that 29,000 of them certainly did not read the article, but they signed petitions accusing me of fraud and all sorts of nefarious things. Anyway, I think the best explanation for this came from a Japanese diplomat. And he said, look, Ramsayr, these guys, they're patriotic. I talked to Japanese second generation immigrants or even first generation immigrants in the US, and they're the same way. They don't follow anything that's going on back in their home country, but they're really patriotic. As a diplomat, you say, okay, it's nice to have people who are patriotic and support the home country. And that's basically, I think, what was going on here. There was another group that was, for me, incredibly disconcerting. Well, two groups. One were the folks in Japanese studies. I usually don't pay a whole lot of attention to American scholars of Japan because the Japanese scholars of Japan are usually significantly better, more insightful, more knowledgeable, and so forth. So I sort of, I basically, for the most part, ignore Americans writing about Japan, which I guess doesn't endear me either. But they were pushing for me to be punished, fired by Harvard for academic fraud, that this article should be retracted, that a bunch of other articles that were in press should be retracted. It made for a god-awful mess to deal with all of this. And then maybe the most troubling of all were people I thought were my friends who weren't in Japanese studies at all. They didn't know Japanese, they didn't know Korean. They certainly knew absolutely nothing about the history of World War II. But lo and behold, they were signing these petitions accusing me of academic fraud and demanding that this article be retracted. These are people who know absolutely nothing about Japan or Korea. They don't even pretend to, but they were signing this stuff. That's sort of what it was like. It was, I aged a lot. One can put on a tough face, but it was very hard. So maybe that's enough for now.
Okay. Thank you, Mark, for those candid words. Nick, before we do the Q&A, we're going to hear from our third speaker. We're going to shift from the history and the politics of history in East Asia to North America with Jonathan Kay, who is I think he's an editor at Quillette. Go ahead, Jonathan. Jonathan, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear fine. Thank you.
So unlike the other speakers, I'm not a scholar. I spent a lot of time in school, but in disciplines that had nothing really to do with what I do for a living now. I do a lot of investigations, so I work for Quillette, which is an Australian-based company, and I'm an investigative reporter. A lot of my investigations have to do with higher education. So I've done major stories on a lot of Canadian universities, a lot of American universities. And I think the topic that aroused the interest of the organizers in regard to colonial narratives, if I remember correctly, was the story of the 215 unmarked graves that were said to have been discovered in Kamloops, which is in British Columbia, which is the westernmost of the Canadian provinces. And I'm just curious, show of hands, how many people on this call have heard of the 2021 unmarked graves scandal in Canada? Is that okay?
Sure.
That's because I read what you write, John.
Okay. Well then, bonus points. So this was quite an extraordinary thing. The situation in Canada, in a nutshell, is that when I went to school as a schoolboy, we didn't learn anything about Indigenous cultures, which is a great shame because Canada wouldn't exist without trade with Indigenous peoples, without the knowledge that was learned from Indigenous peoples. The first Europeans that tried to settle in what is now Canada in the early 17th century, many of them froze to death because they thought that building a house in northern Quebec was just, hey, it's just like building a house in Gascony or in Aquitaine. You know, it's the longitude is similar. They didn't understand the Gulf Stream, so they didn't know that it's about, 30 degrees colder in Canada during the winter. They didn't know how to harvest food. And mostly they were reliant on indigenous peoples to procure furs because the reason that the French, in particular, came to Canada in the 17th century, Samuel de Champlain, was because they wanted fur. They actually originally weren't interested in building colonial settlements. They wanted to do trade. Even before that, the Basques came during as early as the 15th, maybe in the 14th century, to fish off the Grand Banks, and they traded with indigenous people. And so there is a long and fascinating history of European indigenous relations. However, as maybe some people on this call know, we went from not teaching this subject at all when I was in school during, I guess, the 70s and 80s and 90s, to teaching it a lot, but teaching a highly simplified narrative that teaches the idea of Europeans as rapacious colonial exploiters and murderers and cultural genocidaires, and in some cases, real genocidaires. and it's turned into a kind of morality play where indigenous people are actually infantilized. If any of you have seen the Star Wars movies, even respectable journalists have sort of turned indigenous people into the Ewoks. I don't know if you remember the third Star Wars movie where they dance around when the Death Star is destroyed. And I am absolutely not comparing indigenous peoples to Ewoks. They were in, incredible. Well, were in this context incredible warriors, and they understood capitalism, and they drove hard bargains for their furs, and they saved the lives of many Europeans with their knowledge of all sorts of things. But all of that has been reduced to a kind of caricature, where indigenous peoples are shown to be kind of like sort of elves of the forest, exchanging folk wisdom, um, kind of in a sort of secularized version of Christian Eden, and Europeans kind of spoiled this Edenic world. And by the way, as with all morality tales, there is some kind of grain of truth to that. There's absolutely no question that Europeans did horrible things to many indigenous groups. Unfortunately, all of that has been kind of reduced to sort of a very simple and misleading, as I say, morality play. And what you often see is that the nature of this morality play essentially projects whatever the political neuroses or the political interests are of the progressive intellectual class at any one time. So during, because environmentalism and sustainability is a big deal, indigenous peoples are presented as being inveterate environmentalists and stewards of the land. When pacifism was a big deal during the late Cold War, indigenous peoples, to the extent that there was political consciousness of the indigenous issue in Canada, were presented as inveterate pacifists. Now that gender politics is a big deal, we're being told that indigenous peoples they didn't really understand biological sex. Everyone was gender fluid. They had two-spirited people and three-spirited people, and um, and this is, I'm absolutely not mocking the traditions of indigenous peoples, because what I'm mocking here are the fantasies of white scholars and white activists and often white politicians who essentially project their own aspirational beliefs about the perfectibility of the human condition onto these Edenic indigenous societies. Much in the way that if you saw if you see science fiction movies, especially during the late Cold War period, the aliens in science fiction movies were often depicted as like giving these lessons about avoiding war and not spoiling your planet, and basically the space aliens were a projection of whatever humans were worried about at that particular time. In this way, indigenous people, unfortunately, are often reduced to a caricature of, whether it's environmentalism, pacifism, feminism, um, transgender rights. Basically, the idea of what indigenous societies were are sort of reinvented in the white popular Canadian imagination according to the political needs of the progressive class, which I think does a huge disservice to indigenous peoples, because their history is absolutely fascinating. And we're actually running a long series in Quillette called Nations of Canada, which takes a very close look at indigenous peoples. We're in the 17th century now, but we're going to continue the series on into the 18th century. This all brings me back to Kamloops, because, as I said, there was very little interest in indigenous issues when I was a child. And then there was this great awakening of political consciousness in the last 20 or 30 years. Again, in white society, indigenous people obviously were always interested in their own cultures, but unfortunately, this interest is very rarely manifested in genuine intellectual curiosity about what history actually tells us. And mostly it's people are interested in the kind of call it the hashtag version of history. And as a result, there has been a kind of great fervor for something called reconciliation, the idea of making things right by indigenous peoples and making up for, in some cases, very real historical crimes, trying to restore their cultures and language, restore lands that were taken away. In many cases, indigenous peoples were they were kicked off one parcel of land and then sent to another parcel of land because based on what was valuable farmland or whatnot, and then they'd be sent to a third parcel of land, which was often very swampy and marshy. And so, what is now called indigenous reserves are often, in some cases, they don't even correspond to indigenous traditional lands. And so, these are real historical crimes, and there is, in some cases, a good faith effort through this thing called reconciliation to either pay them or recognize or apologize. However, in many cases, it comes down to symbolism, and in some cases, it actually has manifested itself in what can only be described as a social panic. An example, the primary example of which was in 2021, when it was breathlessly announced that 215 unmarked graves were found using ground penetrating radar at the grounds of a former residential school. That is a school where indigenous children were sent to be westernized in British Columbia. And the idea was that, well, if these 215 unmarked graves were found on the premises, the suggestion was that they were murdered, or that they died under horrible conditions of neglect, and that they were thrown into shallow graves by murderous school officials, priests and nuns. These schools were run by religious officials at the time. The Canadian government outsourced it to Protestant and Catholic clerics. And the whole country went nuts. This was late May and June, and then on into the summer of 2021. Newspapers across Canada, TV stations, politicians, everyone was convinced that 215 actual graves of presumably murdered Indigenous children had been found. And we all knew that these residential schools were a blot on the nation's conscience because children died there. I mean, this is real. What I'm about to say is real. They died there at high rates from tuberculosis. In many cases, they were prevented from using their language. These were boarding schools, not in all cases, but in some cases. So the Indigenous people didn't retain connection with their culture. They became estranged from their families in some cases, and as a result, they suffered intergenerational trauma and weren't able to develop the skills as a parent because you learn parenting skills from your own parents. So we had already been primed from real historical information to think the worst of these residential schools. And so when the social panic spread in 2021, that 215 murdered children had been discovered in graves. I mean, this was like out of a horror movie. But we all believed it, including me, for a couple of months at least, because it's like, well, we know these residential schools were projects of what has been called cultural genocide. I guess it makes sense that some of these school officials took it further and perpetrated like real acts of genocide and actually slaughtered children, which, by the way, the historical record up to that point had never shown any instance of like school officials just summarily executing students. That's total nonsense, but that's what basically we were being asked to believe. And then the months passed, and it turned out, well, we didn't find the graves. What we found was ground penetrating radar, soil anomalies, which could be consistent with the presence of 215 graves. The idea is that if you use ground penetrating radar and you find a bunch of regularly spaced soil anomalies, well, that's the kind of thing you find in a graveyard. Of course, you also find that in an orchard, or when you're digging irrigation ditches, or when you're laying cable, or when you're doing a search for unmarked graves 20 years ago and you never found unmarked graves, but the soil anomalies are there from your previous search, or tree roots, or a lot of other things. And that was 4.5 years ago. And 4.5 years after that first breathless announcement that convulsed the entire country into a national period of mourning. I mean, Justin Trudeau, who was then the Prime Minister, lowered Canada's flag on federal buildings for 6 months. The whole country was in I call it a state of purdah. It was astounding. In retrospect, it's astounding because at the time it kind of made sense because they're like, well, I guess 215 dead children. Who wants to be the one who says, hey, can we raise the flag back? It's been a month. Like, no one wanted to be the person to say that. But then the months passed and we were like, all right, where's the bodies? In any scene of mass murder, if anybody on this call, if the police were told that there's 215 bodies at the local provincial park or on the grounds of, I don't know, the local school or whatnot. If it were credible, within hours there'd be guys in hazmat suits and shovels and digging around, like trying to find these bodies that are supposedly there. But nothing like that happened. Um, there's one or two indigenous reserves that actually did, to their credit, discover break ground, because many other reserves claim that they had their own unmarked graves. But in those instances, no graves were found. And in Kamloops, which is where the original story broke, where the 215 original graves or supposed graves are located, in 4.5 years, no one has even broken ground with a shovel. It's clear that those graves don't exist. And yet, only a scattered handful of Canadian media outlets have admitted this. The CBC, which is our national broadcaster, has admitted it. The National Post, which is a broadsheet newspaper based in Toronto, conservative but mainstream, they ran a big article about it on the 1 year anniversary. But to a large extent, the intellectual class is so mortified by their gullibility in regard to the original story that they don't want to implicate themselves by specifically coming to terms with this social panic. And that's where we are today. So I write articles about it in Quillette, which is apparently why I'm on this call. And there's there are a handful of other mainstream, Terry Glavin at the National Post. As I said, the CBC, although in the case of the CBC, it was the public editor who admitted that no graves have been found, and only in the context of rebuking one of his own journalists, this woman named Rosie Barton, who went on a rant on TV attacking another journalist who had had the temerity to bring up the fact that no bodies have been found. And she claimed, well, everyone knows bodies have been found. And the CBC public editor said, well, actually, no. So the CBC, to its credit, has come clean. But again, it was the public editor who did it. Like you would think that the news staff there would, if they treated this like any other story, they'd run a big splash. Like, how did we get this wrong? How did the whole country get this wrong? But no one wants to revisit it because it's mortifying. Because everybody, including me, I believed it. And all of this fits into this. We're talking about colonial narratives. The reason people believed it was because for years, the idea of the colonial presence in Canada has been described as kind of the Darth Vader. And again, I'll stick with this metaphor. The indigenous people were the Ewoks, and so it made sense that Darth Vader was killing all these Ewoks. Like we believed it. And this is what happens when you have a simplified good versus evil morality tale, is you start to become very gullible because it's confirmation bias. Even the most outrageous story, if it fits into the moral framework that you've been conditioned to accept, you believe it. And that's what happened in Canada. And to some extent, it's still happening. There's at least a small handful of academics. It's this guy, Sean Carlton, who now makes his living on this stuff, who will call anybody who admits that no graves have been found a denier or a denialist, suggesting that they're somehow the equivalent of Holocaust deniers, which is disgusting language to use for all sorts of reasons. But these are people who essentially have staked their entire academic career to perpetuating this social panic. And you have one or two politicians who have tried to criminalize telling the truth about this subject. They phrase their legislative initiatives euphemistically. They say, well, it's about residential school denialism. We're going to criminalize residential school denialism. What they're really trying to criminalize is anybody who attacks any kind of sacred narrative, even if it's a false narrative. Fortunately, those legislative initiatives haven't gone anywhere, in part because if they did pass, the CBC would be hauled before a court because, as I said, even the CBC has now admitted there's no unmarked graves. So that's the situation here in Canada. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for the politics, what's going on in Canada. So I wanted to open up for a Q&A. Okay, so anybody from the audience or any of my students? Okay, So collect your thoughts. Let's see. So let me go to gallery mode. Okay. All right. So I'm at gallery mode. So I see everyone. So I see, I see Meredith. I see Chizuko. I see a nice Russian. Was it a Russian name? Okay. Do you guys have any questions or comments? Okay. Can you come up? What? Oh, you're on the screen? Oh, okay. Who raised their hand? Was it? Oh, okay. Go ahead, Meredith. And please introduce yourself. Meredith, we cannot hear you. Okay. Now
Hi,
you're good.
I'm Meredith Shaw. I'm in Tokyo. I first of all, thank you, all three very, very wonderful, interesting, inspiring talks. I have a question for Ernest. Since yeah, your talk was very academic, informative, but since this is a forum for sort of unloading about experiences that we've had with open inquiry, I wonder if you could share with us, have you had any pushback on this research, especially in Korea and China? First of all, have you presented this in Korea and or China, and what is the response when you talk about Japan having this kind of revolutionary, agricultural cooperative, foundational role in something that I think in China and certainly North Korea would be kind of an offensive thing to think about. Have you had any pushback about those ideas yet? And how do you deal with that?
Well, it's happening right now because I was meant to have a talk about Nishihara loans, Nishihara being one of the characters I mentioned in my PowerPoint just now. Um, I was meant to have a talk about Nishihara at Nankai University in Tianjin, and I've had to cancel my talk because of the recent Sino-Japanese crisis. In fact, I've been told by the professor who invited me there to speak at his course that his colleague got into trouble online simply for posting a photograph of Emperor Hirohito on his PowerPoint, and someone took a photograph of that and put that on an online forum, something like Reddit in China, and got the school into some problems. And fortunately, the school discovered it early enough, and the thing was put under control. But I decided that for my own safety, for the safety of the professor who invited me there, and for the reputation of my university, I'm going to delay my talk, postpone my talk until such time comes when Sino-Japanese relations have cooled down a bit. I haven't had the chance to talk about this in Korea yet. I have uh, published a paper at the European Journal of Korean Studies on how there has always been a Japanese factor in even North Korean socialism, um, and that has been received pretty well. But I will be in Seoul in January, and I know that one university in South Korea wants me to go to South Korea again in March to give a talk. I'm not sure precisely which talk they want me to give, and it all involves a reevaluation of Japan's role. Now, I have to state this. I don't condone Japanese colonialism. I don't condone any of the imperialistic violence that was perpetuated by Japan during the early 20th century. I think it's important to realize that very heinous crimes were committed. But sometimes, the thing is, um, the character of something established by Japan changes when the political regime changes hands. I'll take, for instance, the South Manchuria Railway and the cooperatives in Manchuria. These were set up by Japan in order to extract produce. There is no question that it was an extractive mechanism. Yes, Sato Daishiro and the Japanese leftists thought they could have social revolution in Manchuria by setting up uh, agricultural cooperatives run by poor peasants. But the end result was that the agricultural sector became more planned, and therefore it facilitated extraction by the Japanese troops. Now, when 1945 happened, when Japan surrendered and there was chaos, and the Kuomintang initially took over these cooperatives, also in order to extract produce because they were fighting a war against the communists. But let's say when the communists took over in 1948-49, the railways and the cooperatives. And the communist movement at the time was um, highly supported by a majority of the populace who were suffering under various states of oppression by anything from feudal landlords to new military battalions. Once that happened, you can say that the cooperatives and the railways and the mines and the steelworks became the property of the people. So it is important to say that these were extracted. These were, and I'm quoting a North Korean publication from 1948. They say that nationalizing the industrial and agricultural and cultural facilities and assets of the Japanese and of the collaborators turned a weapon against the people into a way of a method or a means of improving the lives of the people. So you don't have to blow things up. You don't have to do like the Khmer Rouge did, blow up the central state bank and declare the country cashless in order to extract people from oppression. You just have to take over the facilities, and the nature of the facilities change. Even without changing the staff, you can still have a democratization of things that used to oppress people. So that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to bring across. We don't have to thank the Japanese for building these things. The railways were built by Chinese laborers anyway. The cooperatives were run by Chinese peasants anyway. But you can say that the nature of things changed after the revolution and it became the property of the people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question from one of my students. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm from the States and I'm studying here at Hanyang. I had a question. Well, first of all, thank you to all the speakers. They're all really interesting talks. I had a question for Mr. Sayer about the article. I read it. It was quite interesting. I was just curious, maybe I missed it in the article, but when you argue about the contracts, one, is there still any like remaining original contracts left, or is it more secondhand evidence? And then the second part of my question is, do you believe that all of the comfort women were exercising their own agency and all chose it and all had the ability to negotiate their contracts? Or do you think it was just a subset of the woman that you're trying to kind of maybe bring a little bit of light to because it goes against the narrative?
Mark,
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. There are form contracts that have survived. There are actually quite a lot of secondhand discussions of people, including by the, I think some by the prostitutes themselves, others by the people who were supervising the comfort stations and so forth. The documents are not state documents. These were private businesses and they were employees. And so the contracts were between the women and the brothels. So to my knowledge, I don't think any of them survive. But there's enough discussion by basically all sides to get a good sense of what these things were. Do I think they all are? No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, there's exploitation in virtually any industry, and this is an industry where The one side, the women were very young, as in mid to late teens, not younger than that. These are not girls. These are young women, but they're either badly educated, as in Japan, or I'm guessing from Korea, they were uneducated completely. And so if you can't read and you've never learned arithmetic, you're going to have a hard time dealing with these contracts. So I think that has to be understood. There are, I think, two sources of exploitation. One is that there are enough discussions of duplicitous recruiters. And these are not just recruiters for the comfort women. These were recruiters who went into the Korean countryside to recruit for the brothels in the big cities in Korea, and also to recruit for the factories. By the accounts that I've seen, there was a substantial amount of fraud going on there. The other sort is, what do you do with bad parents? What do you do with, I think most parents mean well, but some of the comfort women, as well as some of the prostitutes in the Japanese domestic arena, seem to have been sold there by their parents, and the parents took the money and the kids went. In terms of fractions, I have my guesses, but they're just private guesses. I think what one can say with certainty, I think, is that there were a non-trivial number of recruiters who were fraudulent. There were a non-trivial number of parents who took advantage of their kids, and there were a non-trivial number of young, very, very poor women who made this as a rational choice. What the fractions are, I don't think we can say.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Mr. Jonathan as well. I had heard about the Canadian story, and I actually never heard a rebuttal to it. I always kind of just believed it was mostly true. So I enjoyed reading your article on it.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Is there any other question from my students or from the audience members, or maybe the speakers? If you have a question for each other, go ahead, Mark.
This is a question for Jonathan. I thought I read in Quillette that there had been maybe 2 or 3 professors who got in serious trouble when they questioned the mass grave story.
Yeah, so there's at least one professor who was fired from, I think, St. Mary's University. So her name is Frances Widdowson. Frances is actually a very interesting story because I followed Frances Widdowson's career, beginning maybe 20 years ago. She wrote about what she called what was then called the indigenous industry, which largely focused on the web of government bureaucrats, consultants, financiers, who kind of make their living providing services to indigenous groups, often very cynical and dubious, like a whole kind of constellation of white-collar workers who often they live in cities, and maybe they'll represent indigenous First Nations as lawyers on contingency in class action lawsuits and stuff like that. And so she was very much a critic of what she believed was cynical white people who were preying on some of these narratives, and a very respected scholar. But if you've met Frances, and you described yourself as kind of you know, you don't suffer fools gladly, and you're can be a little prickly. She she says out loud what she thinks, and in academia, that can be a very dangerous quality. So I think among 99% of Canadian academics, the idea is whatever you think about this issue, do not endanger your career by talking about it. You're not going to convince people. You're just going to hurt yourself. But she's one of the people who she said out loud what people think, and as a result, she got fired. Um, there aren't a lot of stories like this because Canada's a conservative country, conservative in the European sense of like behavior control. And if you're in academia, you know, I tell people, it says 99% of academics are not political. They just, you know, if you're studying the five-toed newt, you don't want to do anything or say anything that interferes with you studying the five-toed newt. And so you just keep your head down and shut up. And to the extent you say anything political, make sure it's fashionable. You know, attack Israel, attack capitalism, attack the white settler colonial state. That's fine. That's like saying Gesundheit when someone sneezes. No one's really listening. But that kind of politics you can do. But don't say out loud things that you're not supposed to say out loud. And Frances did say it out loud and she got fired. Um, I'm actually speaking on a panel on another subject with her later, but for her, she's an example of she doesn't really have an academic personality. Um, Most academics are actually pretty good at playing the political game, which they do simply by shutting up and keeping their head down. And there are a few that don't. She's one of them. But generally speaking, the people who have led the search for truth on the whole unmarked graves thing have been journalists, even conservative politicians. See, so here's one difference between, say, Japan and Canada. So when I lived in Japan in the 90s, I remember there was these trucks with bullhorns that would go around, and I asked somebody what they were saying, and they said, "Oh, those are right-wing nationalists who are blaring stuff." And there's always been conservative politicians who are fiercely defend what they regard as the authentic history of their country. Often it's not the authentic history of their country, but still, it's a constituency. There's no, that constituency doesn't exist in Canada. We don't have, I mean, there are conservative politicians in Canada who are conservative when it comes to, say, economic policy, or conservative when it comes to, say, immigration policy. But even the Conservative Party of Canada, they do not want to touch the unmarked graves thing with a 10-foot pole because they don't want to give anybody a pretext to call them racist. So they just keep away from that file. Academics absolutely keep away from that file. And so the only people who have really done any metaphorical digging, no one's done any actual digging, but metaphorical digging has been done by journalists such as myself, which I guess is why I'm on this call. Because if there were academics who have studied this phenomenon closely, they'd be a much better guest than me because they actually are academics. But I've done a number of these panels, and the reason I do it is because no one at a Canadian university in their right mind would appear on a panel like this. I can do it because I work for an Australian publication. I mean, to be fair, even if I were at the CBC or the National Post or a major Canadian outlet, I don't think I would endanger my career for doing this because journalists know. I mean, even if most of them aren't willing to say it, they know that the graves aren't there. But academics, in their wisdom, are still required to spout lies on this subject. It's like that George Orwell quote, right? A truth so monstrously, or a falsehood so monstrously idiotic that only an intellectual could believe it. Like that is kind of the state of affairs in Canadian academia on this issue. Yeah. So sorry, long-winded answer, but there you go.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan and Mark. I also had a follow-up question for Dr. Honest Long. I
Yes,
was
sir.
wondering if you get any pushback in Hong Kong. Right now, you're doing a postdoc in Hong Kong, and I wonder how much freedom you have to talk about, like Japanese colonialism. And also, on a related note, you talked about, you're saying all kinds of colonialism is bad. I'm wondering how much pushback if you would get if you talk about, like Chinese colonialism in, say, Xinjiang or Tibet. Is that an even more sensitive topic in Hong Kong?
So Hong Kong is a funny case. Um, there are lots of people in Hong Kong who are very nostalgic about British colonialism. And I've always had the stance because my family has been in government for many generations. We emigrated from central China to southern China about 1,000 years ago, and we've been bureaucrats. Our clan has been bureaucrats since the time of William the Conqueror, and then my grandfather came to Hong Kong, and he was in the Nationalist Army, and he became policeman in Hong Kong, in the Royal Hong Kong Police, and my father was also a Royal Hong Kong policeman. And what they saw within government, and also some of my other relatives were also in government, was that there was a lot of um, racism even, in government. Racial hierarchies were very prominent. Um, there was a mass exodus of Rhodesian and South African policemen from the 1980s, and they came and resided in Hong Kong and took over many of the positions that were originally promised to local Chinese policemen. So, in that sense, I don't have any nostalgia for British colonialism, even though my upbringing is very much a product of that sort of social milieu. But a lot of people in Hong Kong do not realize um, how many blunders there were under colonialism in Hong Kong and how racialist the Hong Kong society was, and Hong Kong's government was during the colonial era. And I, as a historian, am very aware of these things. Now, when it comes to Japanese colonialism, I think you have about a few years ago, there was a major controversy when the university entrance exams, I think it was the history exam question. One of the history exam questions was a database question with two pieces of data showing purported Japanese assistance to China. And then the question was, according to what you know, in 1900 to 1945, did Japan provide more benefit than harm to China? Now, that immediately became headline news. There was a lot of controversy. A lot of people were very indignant about it because of the way that the question was posed. And I wrote a response to this question. My response was that this is not a question of nationalist sentiment. This is a question of an outdated, outmoded kind of historical interpretation where it's a question of black and white, and it's a question of harm and good being diametrical opposites. And you can't really judge a huge historical theatre like Japan and China 1900 to 1945 using black and white mentality. Um, it would be better if also if they specified which class in China and Japan were being affected or were being the perpetrator of such actions. It would have made more sense to ask, did the Japanese elite throughout 1900 to 1945 pose more harm than good to the Chinese masses? Um, and that was not the question that was asked. And I was being attacked by a lot of people from the right wing, which is actually the mainstream in Hong Kong. The right wing, the people nostalgic for British colonialism, for writing something that is purportedly pro-CCP because the CCP was against this exam question, which they saw as being a sign of the infiltration of anti-CCP elements into the government. Now, so I was under fire, and but my response, my essay in response to this exam question became viral. So that was unexpected. Now, when it comes to Tibet and Xinjiang, I guess it depends on whom you ask. again, those people who are most nostalgic about British colonialism or most forgiving about Japanese colonialism are in fact the most damning when it comes to what you call, and I must say it's what you call Chinese colonialism in Xinjiang and Tibet, because they are anti-CCP and they think that CCP rule throughout China was imposed by force. I think that the story in Xinjiang and Tibet is much more um, complex than that. There were communist parties in both Xinjiang and Tibet in the 1940s, and Xinjiang and the PRC were merged together under Soviet mediation in the late 1940s. And it was a very complicated process. I think the word colonization is, in a way, it eradicates the agency of Xinjiang and Tibetan activists who were pro-merger with the PRC. And when it comes to present-day policy in Xinjiang and Tibet, what I think is, again, there is a very complicated arrangement when it comes to which ethnic group controls the party bureaucracy, which ethnic group controls the economy, and usually, well, about 10 years ago, it usually was that the Uyghurs would control government positions. The Kazakhs would control cross-border trade, and the Chinese would control the rest. I mean, the Han Chinese would control the rest. So it's a very complicated thing which has escaped the attention of most Hong Kongers, and certainly this involves both Hong Kongers pro-CCP and anti-CCP. They just don't go into the history of Xinjiang and Tibet and look at it in great detail. They are lost in grand narratives which erase all sorts of nuances. So I think that's the best answer I can give you. That most Hong Kongers are nostalgic about British colonialism. They are they like Japanese culture and therefore are forgiving about Japanese colonialism, and I think this is a malady. And they are also very ignorant about Tibet and Xinjiang, and they fall for grand narratives on both sides of the political spectrum without examining the facts. And of course, you might say, well, we don't know the facts. I would say that we don't know the facts about Xinjiang and Tibet equally as we don't know the facts about many parts of the world. I mean, look, the archives in London do not review their secrets until 30 years after the document is produced. So if we get to know what happens today in Xinjiang and Tibet in 30 years' time, then that will still be a very good thing. But I don't expect 30 years to be a reasonable time period for the CCP to keep its policies secret. I expect a much longer waiting period. I expect that to be reasonable, and I expect that we won't be able to know precisely what happens in these two regions until those documents come to light. And perhaps it would be a century or at least 80, 90 years. You know, as Professor Ramsayer discovered those documents, almost by accident, if I may say so. We might discover documents almost by accident or by total accident about Xinjiang, Tibet, which might totally reverse what we think of these regions, or what we think of the policies being enacted in these regions that we know of today. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, I'd like to thank everyone for speaking. Thank you for everyone for speaking out, and to our audience members, Shishiko and Meredith. And then Ernest, can you stay a little bit longer? I had a quick question
Sure.
for you, private.
Yep.
Okay, all right. So thanks very much. You guys are welcome to stay or leave. It's great to see each and every one of you. Okay, Jonathan, it was great to meet you. Thank you for speaking.
Thank you for including me.
Yes, yes, and I hope my students and we can, encourage them to read and contribute to Collect. Okay, so let's
Yeah,
keep in
definitely.
touch. All right,
Sounds
thank you.
good. Bye,
Great.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Jonathan. Good luck on your next forum.
Thank
Okay.
you. Bye.
Yes. Ernest, that was really
Yes.
interesting.
Thank you, Joseph.
In 2 weeks, I invited Professor Hosaka Yuji, who's more of a progressive perspective on the merger between Korea and Japan. He
Mhm.
thinks it was basically one way. Would you be willing to speak in maybe 2 weeks later about the merger between Xinjiang, Tibet, and China and how it was complicated? Yes, and then we can it doesn't have to be a formal presentation, more like kind of just your informal perspective.
Well, I can't say I'm an expert on this matter. What I've read is secondary literature,
Sure.
and um, well, I mean, if you want me to, talk about a certain topic, I would prefer to stick to something about the Japanese Empire.
I
But I
understand.
can mention Tibet and Xinjiang on the sidelines. I wouldn't make
I
it
see.
the main topic of my presentation.
Sure.
And also, Joseph, I'm going to be in Seoul from 1st to 12th January. So I hope to perhaps see you, and if you want, I can give a talk then in person.
Oh, I see. I'd be traveling America at that time,
Okay.
but I encourage my students to meet you. Do you have any thoughts on the merger between Korea and Japan? Is that something you have more expertise on?
I think the main thing is that from what I understand of Nishihara's involvement in the merger, Nishihara Kamezo was advisor to the first Governor General
Oh,
of
Eric.
Korea.
Hold on just a sec. Students, you go to your team meetings right now. Okay, we only have like maybe 20 minutes left. Okay, so teams 1, 2, and 3, please talk for 20 minutes. The most interesting things that you learned today, and also starting today, I want you to think of like the initial exam question, and essay question, and also like Q&A, like multiple choice. Think about the most interesting essay question and multiple choice questions that you got from today's reading discussion. So, okay, underway. Okay. Okay, sorry, Ernest, go ahead.
Yes, yes. So Nishihara Kamezo was advisor to the first Governor General of Korea, Terence
Mhm.
Masatake, who later became Prime Minister, as I said during my presentation. Now, Nishihara had an interesting time in Korea, even before Korea was annexed by Japan, because he started something called the Ijinhui, the Society for United Progress, if
Right.
it must translate it into English. Now, the Ijinhui was formed to produce an alliance between um, Japanese intellectuals and merchants and Korean reformers.
Sure. Ernest,
So,
is that something you can talk about in a forum in 2 weeks?
um,
Nishihara
yes,
and Ilchinhe? Okay.
yes. So,
Sure.
so to give a very simple answer, I think what Nishihara went through at the time was that he tried to build up an alliance with Korean reformers, but
Mm-hmm.
those reformers were then arrested by the police on the persuasion of Ushida Ryohei, who was a much more radical right-wing campaigner and he was
I
for the annexation of Korea. And so the organization was taken out of Nishihara's hands, and it became part of Uchida's much larger Black Dragon Society establishment. And the Korean reformers were coerced into supporting the annexation or the unification of Japan and Korea. And so Nishihara remained critical of Japan's annexation of Korea, even though he became advisor to the first Governor General of Korea. And also, during the 1910s, when Terauchi was prime minister, he was against Japan sending its troops to China to implicate itself in China's internal convulsions. So,
Sure.
so the thing is,
So-
there was a moment in the 1900s when it was possible to have a different future to the total annexation of Korea by Japan. Perhaps Korea would have been a protectorate under Japan's aegis, but it wouldn't have been totally overtaken by Japan.
Right,
And
right.
that was what Nishihara was fighting for.
Right. Yeah, that sounds great. And also you'll be speaking with Hosaka Yuji. Have you heard of him? He's probably the most famous progressive voice in Korea.
Okay.
So it might anyway. So speaking with Hosaka, it might help you politically when you apply for jobs in the future. Okay.
I see.
Okay, Ernest, I'll send you an email, and then I hope to see you in 2 weeks. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
All right, bye.
Okay, let's stop. 좀 쉬겠습니다.